We are live. Is everyone okay with starting right now? I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay. Hi, Sri. So welcome everyone to the Intro to App Dev. I hope the Changeathon has been going well for you. And if it hasn't, please let us know. We'll try to make it better for the rest of the day. And we've been having some really cool workshops. This one is an Intro to App Dev. So we are doing a React Native workshop. And if you guys don't have any questions, we'll start. Okay. Cool. Let me just start present. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Cool, so we're doing React Native today. I'm gonna be the first lead, and my name is Shristi, and the other lead is gonna be Ryan here. And we're both gonna help you all go through React Native, understand what it is, and maybe start your own project. So what is React Native? React Native is a cross-platform framework that helps you develop apps both on iOS and Android at the same time. So React Native is one of them. It's created by Facebook. Flutter is another one created by Google. And what this does is instead of having two code bases, so natively for iOS or Android, you just make it all in one on React Native or Flutter. In our cases, we're going to be making React Native, and you have the same source code. So it makes it easier for development. Oops, I think I skipped a slide. There you go. Yeah, so the pros of React Native is that it is a faster development time. There is a singular code base, and you can also use it across platforms, right? So Android, iOS, there's a hot reload function, which gives you a live preview of what's happening. So if you've worked with hot reload before, you understand that if you make any changes, you can do a hot reload and then see the immediate changes after. This is really helpful when you're like making a web page or like a page on the app itself, and then seeing like what changes you need to make or how it looks from the current code you have. And it's easier to develop the UI using React Native or cross-platform frameworks because you are just working with a singular code base. You can see the results really fast, and you don't really have to worry about iOS or Android development. Let's talk about the cons. It's just the really big thing is you do have to develop some native code for certain functions on Android and iOS separately. So if you're using like the camera or a push notification or anything hardware related, that's going to be tailored specifically to the devices. But that's like a given, like a trade-off. So you use one singular code base and then you do a little bit of native work, whereas instead of doing like two completely different native works. Okay, let's learn some React terminology. Some of you may already be familiar with this, and if you're not, that's completely okay. So what is a component? A component is essentially the way you encapsulate like repetitive code, some key functionality, kind of like a main thing of argument. A lot of things are going to be components. So in terms of app development, you're going to see like entries in a list be a component, a screen setting be a component. If you are a developer or if you have some coding experience, a component is another word for a function. And if you don't have any coding experience, totally okay. A function is essentially just, think of it as a container that keeps like some part of code reserved there and saves it for every time you want to use it. So every time if you're calling, or if you want to keep a counter for something for different variables, right? You might want to just use a function and have a generic code for how to keep a counter. So that's something that components are super helpful for. And then we have properties, which are going to be the objects that are describing the initial state or status of some parts of the component. More simplistically, it's the functional argument. So if you have a piece of code and it relies on, okay, the variable like name, or like if you have some function that is dealing with some usernames or users, right? You might want to need the name of the person, their account login information, and then their status in the app or like your project itself, right? So those properties are different for every single person, but they have the same generic attributes. And so they come in as function arguments, also called properties in terms of React Native. Okay, so then we have state. This is where it gives you the given condition or status of any of the variables at any given moment. So one example we have is light versus dark mode representation, right? A lot of these apps have light mode and then they have dark mode. And the way you can simplistically just model it and code it is you can have a variable or a placeholder that determines, hey, do you want it to be light? Yes, then true. Or if you want it to be dark, then like light becomes false, right? And depending on the true or false value, which is called Boolean values, you can set the state of your screen to be a light mode versus dark mode. And these can be a lot of different things. So I represented in a very simplistic sense of like light versus dark mode representation and states, but everything that's encapsulated within a variable can be represented as a state to see what the current status and value of it is. Components in React change according to the state. That's why it's called React Native. It comes from the React framework that's used for website building. Okay, so that's the core React terminology. Let's talk about just app dev and web dev terminology that will be useful just in general knowledge. So what is front end? Front end is going to be your user interface and user experience. Another way to see it is, what do you see? So today in this presentation, you see a black screen with white font and some kind of like stylistic choices made there, right? Whoever developed Google Slides made the code so that in the front end, you're seeing these things, right? Like how it looks on the black screen, how the white text looks upon it. So same thing with app dev and web dev, whatever you're seeing in the front or the page itself, that's called front end. And then back end is going to be your actual functionality of how it works. So you can't just have a front end and have like, okay, let me just like make pages and slides. How do those pages move from place to place? How do those pages get data? How does the app transform the data to see something that you want to make more natively, right? That's going to be more back-end functionality. So this can be databasing, this can be functionality programming, this can be, the more complex you get, it becomes into like, how are you integrating data with everything? So yeah, that's like the basic terminology. Does anyone have any questions on this React terminology? Okay. And if you do have any questions, feel free to unmute or just put in the chat box, whatever is easier for all of you. Okay, what are we building today? We are building a list of, okay, excuse my terminology because I am not a gamer, nor am I much on esports, but I believe it is an esports gaming list. As you can see on the left, on the first screen, you have a list of gaming lists or esports that are, I think, in top tiers, and you can try to make a list of favorites of which ones are your favorite, and then goes to the second screen. And then if you click on any of the entries on the list, then it comes into a small details information about the sport itself or the team itself. Okay, and you can find the starter code on the repo, github.com, gamebot. I'll also put it in the chat box for all of you. It's already pre-developed, so you can go ahead and copy that information over whenever and clone the repo so that you can run the app itself. Let me go ahead and put in the chat box. And Ryan's going to go more on this GitHub repo as well. But the iOS, these are the commands. We're not going to do a very live tutorial of React Native and terminal itself because it's a huge setup time and might take over the time we have today in our call. But what we can do is, if you want to go ahead and start setting it up, they have instructions on React Native documentation that you can look up. And if you ever get stuck throughout today or ever, you can always feel free to reach out to me on Discord. Ryan's going to be there too. And yeah, I think somewhere in the documentation, you can just see how to like install it. And yeah, we'll all be available on Discord, so you can help out come into office hours and we can help you out there. And from here, I think Ryan's going to take over.
Okay. All right. Yes. Oh, I need screen share.
One sec.
Okay.
You can do it now.
All right. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? All right. Yes, no, maybe so.
Yeah, we can, sorry.
Okay. All right. So as we can see, it does work or work on an emulated thing. If this were in person, I could probably show you this working on my physical phone, but not the case. So here we've got a bunch of teams. You can add things to favorites, make it to go display favorites, remove things from favorites, click on them to see details, but the details screen doesn't really show anything. And so on and so forth. Okay. So like they were saying earlier, I guess one of the first questions you have to ask is where exactly are we getting all this data from? So usually you would get this data from like a server. So you would probably go query like your database to get this sort of data. But this time, just to make things real easy for you guys, I just put it all in this file like this. It's probably a lot easier to follow along that way. So pretty much, all right. So there's pretty much only 3 main files to this app, and we're just gonna go over them pretty in depth. You can't really. It's kind of hard to like in an hour time sort of get all the setup done and get everything working because the setup is quite tedious and painful, and there's always something that goes wrong that's different for every single other person. So besides that, we'll just go into the actual app. So this is app.js. This is like your main file. So in our case, what we're doing here is essentially we're just long story short, we're just basically defining all the possible sort of screens you can see. So like earlier, they're talking about like the main screen, the detail screen, so on and so forth. Those are like examples of like different things, different sort of screens to show. So like for instance, if I click on this, I go here. This is a different screen. So all I'm doing here really is just defining the different screens and basically saying the name home is associated with the home page. And the details name is associated with the details page. And so on and so forth. So the real meat and bones of all this is the home page. This is real simple app. Not much to do here. Okay. So one of the first things we're going to look at is here this use state. So earlier we were talking about state and how it sort of like encapsulates like the current sort of status of this component. So all this is basically doing is saying I have a state item called favorites. So we're going to keep track of the things we favorited. And I have a function that allows me to manipulate the favorites. That's what this notation here means. And somewhere here, I have something, a state sort of instance variable called filter favorites. It's initially set to false. And I can use set filter favorites instead to true or false. That's pretty much what that is. Make sense, everyone? Let me pull up chat real quick. Okay.
I'm monitoring the chat. It seems like everything makes sense.
So when you use this sort of navigation router, it's basically this object that routes your app to the correct component at the correct time. You gain access to this property called navigation, and this is what we're going to do to sort of transition between the different screens. And I guess we'll just go from top to bottom. So we're gonna get back to later. This is related to code down here. So this is just a bunch of styling.
One quick thing, Brian, can you zoom in into your code a little bit?
Oh, yes. Is that better?
Yeah, that's a lot better. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so this is just like a bunch of styling. If you've done CSS, it's kind of the same thing, except everywhere where you see a hyphen, it's just now camel case for the properties. So camel case is like the first one is lowercase, and the next words are all uppercase for the first one. This is pretty complicated to explain and probably take a whole workshop to explain what's going on here. So we'll come back to that if there's time. So we have here our first little component. And so here we basically say in this component, this is just code for the status bar to sort of make sure it's not covered up by the app. This is to make sure the app is within like a renderable area. This is you're not going to really see the effects of this unless you have like a phone with a notch, for instance. This is kind of important because the notch is the screen area is a little unconventional. I'd always keep it in there though, just in case. And so basically now we have two main things. So right here, this touchable opacity, this is basically a button. In fact, it's this button up here. Touchable opacity is just basically a button. And basically we're giving how it's styled from this thing down here, the style sheet. A little complicated. I'll explain that later. And basically we're saying when I press this thing right here, we're changing the state. So remember earlier, we defined this right up here. This is a function that allows you to set the value of the state variable filter favorites. And basically it just sets it to be the inverse. And this is what we want actually, because basically every time we click it, we want it to go from displaying favorites to displaying all. And so that's why we do this. Okay. And then inside the button, we have to add the text right here. So this is basically saying if filter favorites is true, so like this, where we're displaying all our favorites, we want the text here to say display all, because that's what we want to do after we click it and go back. And otherwise, we do only display favorites. Does that make sense so far? Everything making sense so far? No, I'll take your silences.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, we had a question.
Okay. How are you seeing the picture of the phone? Is that some VS Code extension? Are you talking about this?
Yeah.
No. This is something that comes with the React Native setup. It is a emulated phone. It's not on VS Code.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, it's like I think on Flutter you also have to set up an emulator, so that way on VS Code you can kind of emulate it. It's like the same thing here.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Now, after that, we have a list. So here's our list of 10 teams, 10 franchise teams in the LCS. So this one's a little complicated, so we're gonna go one by one. Okay. We'll get rid of the unimportant stuff first. So key extractor item string item.rank. So basically, long story short, when you have a bunch of items in the list, React kind of throws a hissy fit at you if you don't assign some sort of unique label to each sort of item. So that's all that this is. You would normally put this to like either like the item's identification, or you can literally just do like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so data, this is what we're gonna pass in to the flat list. And each item in data is gonna okay, let's take this one at a time. Okay. So data is basically our data that we're pulling from. And each item in the data, this render item call is going to be called with that item as the argument. And so basically all it's doing is I take every single data item we have, and we're going to call this render item up here, and it's going to render these 10 things right here. And yeah, this is basically saying if we have the filter favorites on, so like right now, we only want to render our favorite teams, and otherwise we want to render all of the teams. That's what that is saying. And now I guess we're gonna have to go into the not so fun part, a little complicated, pretty complicated part. Up here, render item. So basically every single item in data. So I'll go into data real quick. So every single one of these JSON objects basically gets passed into this render item function. This really should be its own component, like especially all this stuff down here. It's really complicated, and really you should put this in your own component. But if I put this in my own component, it would add a lot more complexity to it. So for beginners, I just decided to put it in here just to make things nice and simple for you guys. So basically, render item, there's a lot of arguments to render item. I don't remember them at the top of my head, but all we care about is getting the item itself. And that's what this is. Basically, for each item, we're just going and we're getting all of these sort of things. This is little properties. Okay. And then we have more code here. And this is going to render. This code is responsible for rendering every single one of these items, basically. So we're going to go through it again. So again, we have a button because on press, we get to navigate to this detail screen, which doesn't have anything. It's just for demonstration purposes. And basically, the styling of it, we get from all the way down here, complicated stuff. And on press, we basically tell the app, on press, I want you to navigate to the detail screen. So the detail screen is this one right here with certain arguments. So we pass in the arguments of the name and the logo. So that way when we press on the different thing, we get a different name and logo for every single person. And then we go into more things here. Okay, so we have an image here. All this basically is saying is I'm just going to render the logo. And then we have more text here. So that's what this and this is here. This is basically saying I render the logo, team name, record. I forgot what split I took this from. Might be Spring 2020. And then we basically have this button here, add to favorites. But the thing about this is we don't always want this to say add to favorites. Like for instance, if we're displaying favorites, we want to be able to remove from favorites. That's how that works. And not only does like the text have to change, the sort of functionality when you click it also has to change. So for instance, when we want to remove from favorites, what we're going to do is much different from what we do from adding to favorites. So when we add to favorites, basically, so the thing about these sort of state objects is you can't make a new object, if that makes any sense. You can't just like you can't just like it's kind of hard to like directly change so itself, because you always have to keep you always have to remember that you have like a variable to like sort of represent the initial state, and basically you want to make new states that are initially based off of this variable. You think of it as like inheritance sort of. In each state, we don't want to like we can't like or most of the time you want to change the state based off the pre-existing state. That's the best way to explain it. So that's what this here is doing. This here is basically saying I'm gonna take all my favorites and then I'm gonna just slap on this new item at the end to my favorites. And then remove from favorites, basically we're just gonna find the item that we want to remove and then just cut around it, if that makes sense. And finally, because we skipped over it, we have the detail screen. It's pretty simple. Pretty much we can get these parameters right here. We pass them these parameters, and so this is how you extract them. You basically right here, and all you basically do is you just render the name and logo for that. And that's pretty much it. That's the whole app. It's pretty complicated. Does anyone have any questions?
I don't know if it was in this file, but I think I think it was in the main app.js. Actually, no, it wasn't in this one. There was like a it's like a syntax question. So there was like an equal sign and then like a greater than thing. I just kind of wanted to know what that syntax was for or what that was used for. So yeah, like right there on line 40, like after the on press.
Are you talking
So
about this right here?
yeah, so what does that do?
Oh, okay. So this here, this is a Lambda function. So this is basically this is equivalent of like this up here, how we have like a function, but but the difference is normal functions you give a name, Lambda functions you don't. You just kind of have the syntax. So here, this is like your arguments to the function, and this is what you want the function to execute. And this is pretty shorthand. This is like kind of shorthand. Technically, I guess in this case you don't have to return something, but you always should remember to return something. Usually, it's like a normal function. Sometimes you have to return things. In this case, we actually don't, because all we're doing is we're telling the app to navigate to a different screen. Let me see if there's an example of one where we actually do return something. Oh, right here. So for example, for render item, we have to remember for each item, we actually have to return the sort of code used to render the item. So you have to remember to do this basically. And that's basically it.
Gotcha.
It's just a function.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions? There's like 30 minutes left.
Yeah, that's okay. We can keep it short, but here to answer any questions. It can be about React Native or anything in general, or just app dev. I think Ryan and I have quite a few experience with app dev. Okay, then if there are no more questions, I think we can end it here. Thank you all for coming. Of course, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to send it in the Discord. We also, if you look in the free chill channel, we have several app dev workshops, Flutter, React Native, from the summer and from Hack Texas and Learnathon. So go ahead and check out those resources. This video will also be available on our YouTube channel. It's currently being live streamed. Yeah, have a good luck with the